Hello, my name's Wendy and I have the blog artygirl2010 at blogspot.com. I'm here today to share with you how I make a fabric art journal. I first started making art journals when I was doing the online art journal course called Lifebook. Each week we worked on a page separately and then at the end of the year put them together into a book. So I came up with this technique which opens like a regular book. I like it because I find that when I bind with rings, it's very hard to open the pages. My next project was this fabric art journal, and this is the first one that I made. I had a stack of textile pieces I'd made in workshops, plus a few canvases that I'd painted. And I just had them stored in a box, but I wanted to display them somehow, so I came up with this book idea. This book, the first one that I made, has different size pages because I simply used the size of the textile pieces as they were and just cut the canvases to fit the back. It's a very simple idea, and you can see how there's all different size pages there. After that, I joined a textile group, and each month we were learning a new technique. And I wanted to do something with those, so I made this fabric art journal. I put paper pages in so I could write in instructions or glue in the printed ones that we were given, and also add some of the little samples of what we'd done. But I also did a textile piece with each technique, so I would have that for future reference. I no longer put the paper pages in my journals. But if you want to do that, it's a pretty simple technique. I just folded a piece of paper in half and then stitched it down the middle into the book. This one has some of the textile art stitched to it, but others just have samples. So it's up to you whether you do that. I'm prefer now to have all of this sort of thing in a separate little book and just have a fabric art journal with only fabric pages. The reason I like this technique is because it gives me a lot of creative freedom. I can work on pages separately, which means that they'll easily fit under my sewing machine if I'm doing machine stitching, or I can just pick them up and do hand stitching with just a small project. It also allows me to use any mixed media technique I like, and I'm not worried about whether it will get onto other pages or it may not work, because if it doesn't work I can just throw it away or recycle it somehow. It also allows me to pick any colour I like, because I'm not going to have to hang it on the wall, so I don't need to match decor. And it allows me to try a lot of different techniques and store them in a very small space, just a book on a shelf. So let's get started. When I make the pages for my books, I like to finish off the edges so there's no fraying when the book's complete. You could use satin stitch around the edge if you like. I don't choose that technique because I just don't like to do it. I think it takes too long for me. Most of the time now I just turn the excess material over to the back and stitch it down. For this one I've used a piece of Aida cloth as the stabilizer, simply because I have a lot of it and I'm trying to use it up, and it's very easy to stitch through when I do hand stitching. So I'm just using that at the moment, but other times I just use regular stabilizer. When I do quilting, this one has a facing to it. Others I use binding, because I find with quilting you need to do something to cover up the edge. It looks untidy otherwise. And this piece was a piece of canvas, stitching canvas, so it had very untidy edges, so this got binding as well. When I do the binding, I do it like you normally would on the front, but on the back I just fold it over and don't worry about folding under the edges, because nobody's going to see it when it gets stuck to the back of another page. If I use felt as my backing piece, which I do quite often, this piece has felt on there with a little bit of stiffener on the back. But if I use felt, I just don't worry about the edges because felt's not going to fray. This one also was felt, and this has a very heavy stabilizer on the back because of all the machine stitching that I did. So some of your pages you'll probably want to put stabilizer on. When I first started, I thought that I needed to make all the pages stiff like a regular book, but now I don't worry about it because even if it's floppy, it won't matter when people are turning the pages. It's up to you. If you want to make them really stiff, then buy some stiff interfacing and put it on the back of it. Once I've made all the pages, I spread them all out on a very large surface, which for me is my kitchen counter, and then I like to group them together in pairs. The reason I do this is so that when you pick up the book, the two sides of the page that are facing will be sort of matching, similar in colour or tone. They don't have to be the same technique. They don't even have to match exactly, but just to my eye, I feel like they go together. They might be completely different. This one was very busy, so I chose a fairly neutral page to go opposite it. And I do that all the way through. It's not always going to work out. You're going to have a few odd pages, but just to my eye, they will look pleasing. So now we're ready to start making the signatures for our book. A signature is a group of pages put together. In a regular book, it's about 8 actual pieces of paper that they stick together to make signatures. To do this, we need this little strip of fabric which will be put in between our pages to hold them together. I usually cut it a little longer than the page length and then fold the ends under to make it neat. This one has a selvage edge, but this top edge I've just folded it over and zigzag stitched just to neaten it off. I could have done a straight stitch. I just did a zigzag stitch so it wouldn't fray. So I start with the first page, place it face down and pop this on face up, because the bit that you see in between the two pages is this tiny little bit here, so I like it to be face up. I pop the next page on top, and I usually like to match up this edge here as well as the top and bottom. This top page, the red one, is slightly smaller than the blue, so by matching up this side, when people are reading your book, they'll think it matches up perfectly, and then this side will be hidden by this little strip of fabric, so it doesn't matter that it doesn't match up. And I start by pinning this far side in the corners, and I pin this corner as well. If your pages are a bit stiff to pin, these ones are okay, but if they were too stiff, I would use pegs or clips to hold it. And then once the corners, those far corners are pinned, I pin these ones. And then I stitch it all around, and that catches in that flap of fabric and it joins the two pages together, so you can no longer see the backs and they'll all be neat and tidy. I usually choose a thread colour that will match on both top and on each side. So on this side I would use a red or orange, and on this side I would use this purpley blue colour probably. So sometimes I have different colour thread top and bottom. of my sewing machine. And then when I do the stitching, I use a sewing machine. You could hand stitch it if you wanted to. A simple hand running stitch would actually hold it together, would be strong enough to hold it together. Or you could do a blanket stitch or something. So once you've done that, it looks like this. This one I've used white thread in the top because white is part of the design. And I've used a green here because I didn't want it to stand out. So, and that's stitched in there. So now we want to add the next 2 pages. So I'll just lay this page number 3 on top. And then fold over this little bit, the flap. And I usually just pop a pin in to hold it for a second while I get the other page ready. And I make the pins stick out so I can take them out and put them in after I've got the other page on. Now I don't pull this flap up tight. There is a little bit of extra fabric there, which will just help when we sew it together later on. So then I would pop this one on, line up these edges, pin it in the 4 corners, and then again stitch around the corner. Well, stitch around the entire square. So once you've done that and you take the pins out, this is what you'll end up with. A signature. And you can see when I line the pages up that there's a little bit of extra fabric sticking out there. That's just because when I put this into the spine of the book, we actually stitched down the middle there. So it's just helps the pages to bend better if there's just a little bit of extra fabric there. So once you've done that with all of the pages of your book, then you're ready to put the spine on. If you have, when you do multiples of 4 for your pages, you'll end up with a whole bunch like this. But if you do just do an even number like I've done, you'll end up with an extra 2 pages. Again, do the same thing, but then just leave that like that. And when we do put the cover on, that will connect into the cover. So it won't matter that you haven't got an extra 2 pages to go with that one.